The courtroom had seen its share of high-profile witnesses, but when the double doors creaked open and Bishop T.D. Jake stepped inside, everything stopped. Cameras lowered. Pens froze mid-sentence. Even the judge leaned slightly forward, as if the air had thickened. Jake was not wearing his usual flowing robe or standing behind a pulpit. No spotlight, no choir, no congregation. Just a plain black suit, a clenched jaw, and the kind of silence that makes even seasoned reporters nervous. He walked slowly, not because of age, but because of the truth he carried. He didn't make eye contact with the gallery, not yet. He moved as if each step required permission from his conscience. And maybe it did. When he reached the witness stand, he placed his hand on the Bible, one he had preached from 1,000 times, and raised his right hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." The oath echoed. For a moment, the courtroom wasn't a chamber of justice. It felt like a confessional booth. The prosecutor, calm but piercing, rose from her table. "Bishop Jake, have you known Mr. Diddy personally?" Jake didn't blink. "Yes," he said, "for years." "How did the relationship begin?" A pause. Jake's eyes drifted upward for a second, then back to the prosecutor. "He came to me for counsel. Said he was tired of the industry's demons following him home. Said he wanted to change." The gallery shifted. This wasn't the narrative they had expected. The prosecutor took a careful step forward. "Did he ever confess anything troubling to you?" Jake's throat tensed. He glanced down at his folded hands. "Yes," he said finally. "Things no man wants to say out loud. Things that haunted him and me." "Can you be specific?" Jake looked up. His voice, though steady, carried a rawness that silenced the room. He talked about control, about power, about how he could silence people with favors. "He once told me, a pastor's word holds more weight than a contract." A hush fell over the courtroom. The prosecutor moved closer. "Did you ever witness behavior from Mr. Diddy in private settings that conflicted with your spiritual standards?" "I was invited to one of his private events in Miami," Jake said. "It wasn't a party, it was something else. Temptation was everywhere. Women, music, money. But more than that, it was the performance of dominance. He enjoyed watching people fall morally. That gave him satisfaction." The judge's brow furrowed. A juror scribbled a note, hand shaking. "Did you confront him?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes, in 2015. I told him, you're not just destroying others. You're losing yourself." He looked at me and said, "That's the price of staying on top." A woman in the gallery gasped. "And what did you do then?" "I left. I prayed for him, but I stayed silent." The words hit harder than a scream. "And why did you stay silent?" Jake's eyes closed briefly. "Because I thought I could save him from the inside. Because I was afraid. Afraid no one would believe that a man who raised his hands to heaven could also raise hell behind closed doors." The prosecutor paused. She let the silence linger. "Bishop Jake, you are a man of faith. You've preached to millions. Why speak now?" Jake looked toward the jury. His voice cracked, but he didn't look away. "Because silence can damn a man as much as sin. And I've carried the weight of both. I've preached about truth and courage, and yet I failed to live by it. I'm here now because truth delayed is still truth owed." There was no coughing, no papers rustling. The courtroom had stopped breathing. The prosecutor took another slow step forward. "Did Mr. Diddy ever express remorse for these things?" Jake exhaled. Not the kind of remorse you'd expect. He didn't regret what he did. He regretted that it caught up to him. Another gasp, this one louder. Did he ever share with you any philosophies or phrases that disturbed you? Jake nodded. He once said, "People don't respect fear. They respond to it. That's the difference." I remember feeling sick after hearing that, because to him, that wasn't theory. That was policy. The jury shifted. One leaned forward, another rubbed their eyes. Did he ever use your name or image to provide legitimacy? Jake's voice turned grave. Absolutely. He would invite me into rooms so people would feel safe. They'd see me and think, if Bishop Jake is here, it must be okay. I was a spiritual seal on a toxic machine. The prosecutor didn't move. And what did you do? Jake's voice dropped. I prayed, I laid hands, I offered counsel, but I didn't walk away. I should have, but I didn't. Why not? The prosecutor asked. Because I thought I was chosen to change him. Because I thought influence could redeem power. I was wrong. The room felt colder now. Not because of temperature, but because the walls had absorbed the weight of Jake's confession. Do you believe your silence enabled abuse? Jake didn't hesitate. Yes, I believe my silence made him feel invincible. And invincibility in the wrong hands becomes destruction. The words didn't bounce. They landed. Have you ever received warnings not to speak? Yes, Jake said quietly. Not always directly. Sometimes in favors. Sometimes in protection I didn't ask for. I was told, be careful what bridges you burn. You're too visible to make enemies. I was told I was too blessed to be controversial. The jurors exchanged glances. Did Diddy ever say this himself? Jake nodded. In 2016, backstage at an awards show, he leaned in and said, "You're one of the only ones I trust. Don't break that." And what did you feel? Jake looked down. I felt like my loyalty wasn't to God anymore. It was to him. And I hated that feeling. And the prosecutor's voice was sharper now. When you stood on stage and preached about truth, about accountability, did you believe you were living it? Jake paused, longer this time. Then he said, "Not fully. I told myself I was walking in grace, but in hindsight, I was walking in fear." A gasp broke the silence. Do you think others in your circle felt the same pressure? Absolutely, Jake said, and many still do. This wasn't just about money or fame. It was about silence. It was about who stayed quiet and why. The prosecutor let that settle. Then she asked, "Did anyone ever confront you?" "Yes," Jake said. "A young pastor from Georgia messaged me in 2021. He said, 'Why do we keep blessing devils with platforms?' I never responded, but I've thought about that message every day since." The courtroom stood still, not by command, but by reverence. "And what would you say to him now?" Jake's eyes were glassy. "I would say, I hear you now, and you were right. We cannot lay hands on brokenness and call it healed. We cannot baptize corruption with grace. We must name it. We must confront it, even if it costs us everything." The air was thick with something heavier than judgment. "Did Diddy ever tell you directly not to speak?" "Not with words," Jake said, "but with expectations, with strategy, with positioning me as a symbol of safety while hiding chaos behind me." The prosecutor took a beat. Then the final question of the day. "Bishop Jake, what is the one moment, the one truth that has haunted you most?" Jake's face changed. Not like a man under oath, but like a man staring into the pit of his past. "There was a night," he said, "in Los Angeles. Diddy invited me to what he called a men's reset weekend. It sounded spiritual, but it wasn't. It was secrecy dressed as sanctity. At one point, I walked past a suite. I heard shouting. I saw a young man in tears. I heard Diddy say, 'You want access? Then you do what's required.' Someone stopped me at the door and said, 'This isn't your kind of ministry.' And I turned around. I left." He paused. "That's the moment that's haunted me every day since." No one moved. No one exhaled. And when the judge finally called for a recess, no one stood, because something irreversible had happened. And Chapter 1. Jake's confession was only the beginning. The courtroom remained suspended in silence even after the judge's gavel echoed, as if the weight of Jake's final sentence still pressed down on every breath. When the doors closed behind him for recess, people didn't leave their seats. They sat frozen, eyes locked on the now empty witness stand. It wasn't a chair anymore. It was a confessional altar. By the time Jake returned, something had shifted in him. His suit looked darker under the fluorescent lights. His hands no longer trembled, but his eyes held a storm. When he sat down again and faced the courtroom, the atmosphere didn't just regain its tension, it multiplied. The prosecutor rose slowly, her face calm but sharpened by what they'd already heard. "Bishop Jake," she began, "earlier you testified that Mr. Diddy used you to legitimize his image. Did you ever feel that your presence was being used intentionally to cover up his behavior?" Jake didn't hesitate. "Yes, he didn't just invite me to events. He positioned me. I was always in the photo, always visible. When people saw me, they let their guard down. That was the point." "Were there particular moments when you realized that?" Jake nodded. "Too many. But one stands out. It was 2017. He asked me to open a speech at a charity gala. I thought it was a fundraiser for underserved youth. It was. But backstage there were women being shuffled in and out of side rooms, executives whispering in tight corners. Something felt off. I prayed publicly and privately walked away sick." "Did you ever confront him about using your presence that way?" Jake's jaw clenched. "Not directly. I hinted. I said I felt uncomfortable." He laughed, said, "Uncomfortable means it's working." I never forgot that. A few jurors gasped quietly. "What did you do after that night?" Jake took a long breath. "I released a message about boundaries, about knowing when your assignment ends. People thought I was speaking generally. I wasn't. I just didn't name him. And that was my failure." The prosecutor nodded, then paced slowly. "In 2020 and 2022, did anyone from Mr. Diddy team ask you to publicly defend him?" "Yes," Jake said. "In 2020, he called me directly, said people were dragging his name, said he needed someone trusted to vouch for his transformation. He said, 'You don't have to mention me, just talk about the grace.' I did. I released a short video about forgiveness and redemption. I didn't say his name, but everyone knew who it was for." "And in 2022? "His assistant contacted me. Said there was a journalist preparing to release a damaging story. They wanted a quote, something to balance the optics. I declined. That was the first time I said no." "Why did you say no then?" Jake's voice was low but unwavering. "Because I knew if I said yes, I was done. Spiritually, ethically, I'd already crossed too many lines. I couldn't cross one more. The prosecutor let that settle. Then she asked, "Why didn't you speak out then?" Jake stared straight ahead. "Because I was still afraid. Afraid of what it meant to stand alone. Afraid of what it would cost. I had built a ministry on wisdom, but I wasn't brave. Not yet." The courtroom didn't move. "Did you regret the times you defended him?" "Every day," Jake said, "because I wasn't defending a man. I was defending my own cowardice." "Did anyone in your personal or spiritual circle confront you about your relationship with him?" "Yes," Jake said. "Some questioned me. A few warned me. A young pastor once said, 'Why do we keep anointing manipulation?' I dismissed it then. I see it now." And the prosecutor walked toward the witness stand slowly, like approaching an altar made of ashes. "Bishop Jake, you have said that you withheld the truth, that you were used to protect an image. But did anyone else ever pressure you not to speak, directly or indirectly?" Jake nodded. "Yes, there were phone calls, offers, reminders of projects he'd supported. One time, someone said, 'Don't ruin what we've built.' I realized then I was part of a we I never agreed to." "What did that make you feel?" "Trapped," Jake said, "like I had been drafted into a war without armor." The prosecutor took a step closer. "Did you ever express to Mr. Diddy that you were uncomfortable with being used as a cover?" "Yes," Jake said. "In 2018, I told him I needed space, that our association was starting to raise questions." He smiled and said, "Let them ask, as long as they don't find answers." That was the moment I realized he didn't fear exposure, he mastered how to control the lens. "And what did you do after that?" Jake paused. "I went silent again. Not because I didn't know better, but because I didn't want to pay the cost of knowing." The room had become still again, the stillness of people realizing they've misunderstood a person for years. "Did your silence allow others to get hurt?" The question hung like a sword over the courtroom. Jake nodded. "Yes, my silence gave credibility to corruption, and I can't undo that." "Why are you here today?" Jake looked at her, then at the jury. "Because redemption doesn't come through silence. It comes through confession. And I'm tired of carrying mine in private. What do you hope this courtroom takes from your testimony?" Jake's voice rose slightly, not in volume but in depth. "That power isn't always loud. Sometimes it wears a smile. That spiritual men aren't immune to compromise. And that silence, wrapped in scripture, is still sin." "Do you believe the culture surrounding Mr. Diddy made it hard for others to speak?" "Yes," Jake said, "because silence wasn't demanded, it was rewarded. And I was a part of that reward system. My presence said, 'This is safe.' But it wasn't." "Have any victims ever approached you?" "One," Jake said. "In 2019, after a service, a young woman waited in the lobby. I recognized her. She looked at me and asked, 'Do you still talk to him?' I said no. She nodded and walked away. That was it. But that moment never left me." "Why do you think she asked that?" "Because she needed to know if I was still one of them, if I was still protecting him." The prosecutor was quiet. The jury, too. "Do you regret not asking for her story?" Jake nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes, because I think she wanted to tell it, but only if I wasn't still wearing the mask." "Do you believe he used your platform to silence others?" "Yes," Jake said. "He used my integrity like a badge, so people would trust the space. And when they got hurt in it, my silence sealed it. What would you say to those who were hurt in those spaces? Jake didn't blink. I'm sorry for standing too close to darkness and calling it ministry, for letting them think the silence was holy. It wasn't. It was fear. The gallery was still. Even the judge sat back, fingers steepled as if holding something invisible in his hands. Bishop Jake, the prosecutor said finally, you've said you knew about moments that crossed moral lines. Were there any that crossed legal ones? Jake's throat tightened. There were whispers, stories. I never saw crimes, but I saw damage. I saw fear. I saw people disappear professionally, relationally, after they pushed back. In this industry, silence isn't just safety, it's currency. Did he ever speak about that? Yes, Jake said. He once told me, you want loyalty? Get dirt first. Loyalty second. It wasn't a joke. It was how he operated. Why did you stay close to him for so long? Jake didn't flinch. Because I believed I could change him, that my light could overpower his shadows. But I was wrong. I was too close to see I was becoming part of the darkness. The room remained silent, not from order, but from gravity. And as the judge called another recess, no one moved again. Not because they were tired, but because they finally saw the truth standing in front of them, and it looked like a preacher unraveling not just Diddy Combs' image, but his own. By the time Bishop Jake returned to the stand for the third time, there was no illusion left in the room. The silence didn't feel reverent anymore. It felt raw, like everyone was sitting in the middle of something that had already broken. No gavel could undo it. No sidebars could reframe it. Even Diddy Comb, seated at the defense table, no longer postured. He didn't smile, didn't glance at the jury. He simply stared ahead, as if the weight of Jake's words had finally pierced through whatever armor he thought he had left. The prosecutor rose again, this time slower, gentler, but her eyes never lost their edge. Bishop Jake, she said, you've described moments where you felt used, where you recognized manipulation, where silence cost more than you realized. But was there ever a moment where you felt complicit not just in spirit, but in action? Jake didn't look away. Yes, he said. There was a moment when I knew exactly what I was doing, and I did it anyway. Can you describe that moment? 2016, Jake said. Backstage at an awards show. Diddy Comb approached me, nervous for the first time I'd seen. He said rumors were building. He needed someone to say on camera that he was changed, that he had grown. He told me, you don't have to lie, just talk about grace, talk about redemption. People trust you. And did you? Yes, I went home. I wrote a message about transformation. I recorded a video about forgiveness. I never said his name, but he didn't need me to. Everyone knew. And that video was shared by his team, over and over. It became the cover he needed, and I gave it to him. The room didn't move. Why did you do it? Jake looked straight at the jury. Because I was afraid of what not doing it would cost. Not just to me, but to my ministry, my partnerships, my reputation. I justified it. I said, it's just a general message. But I knew better. I knew who it was for. And I knew who I was protecting. The prosecutor took a slow breath. Have you spoken publicly about that moment before? No, Jake said. This is the first time I've said it aloud. Why now? Jake's voice cracked slightly. Because confession without honesty is just performance, and I've performed enough. Have others in your sphere, other faith leaders, ever challenged you privately about this? A few, Jake said. One man called me and said, "Are we here to shepherd or to shield?" I told him I was doing both. But he was right. You can't do both, not when the wolf is in the room. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly. Have you ever heard of others being pressured to stay silent by Diddy or his associates? Jake nodded. Yes, I've seen artists shelved for speaking too loudly. I've seen pastors lose donors. I've seen conferences rescind invitations when someone asks the wrong question. It's not always direct. It doesn't need to be. Silence in this business is taught, not told. Did you ever tell yourself that staying close to him was the only way to protect others? Jake's face tightened. Yes. I told myself that if I left, someone worse would take my place, that I could monitor from the inside, that I was the balance. That was a lie. I wasn't balancing anything. I was enabling everything. Do you believe Diddy knew you were struggling with that line? Yes, Jake said. He once told me, "You're too visible to switch sides. If you go against me, it won't just hurt you. It'll hurt everyone who follows you." And he was right, but only because I gave him that power. The jurors looked stunned. Some leaned back. Some leaned forward. But none remained neutral. Did that power affect your decisions? Not my convictions, Jake said, but my clarity. I delayed speaking. I softened truths. I told myself the mission was bigger, but it wasn't. I was just afraid of losing what I had built. The prosecutor stepped even closer. Do you still believe your silence was strategic? No, Jake said. It was cowardice, dressed in scripture, dressed in sermons, but it was fear. And fear preached is still fear lived. The room felt smaller, not physically, but spiritually. Have you ever considered walking away entirely? Yes, Jake said. After the night in Los Angeles, after that young man, after the hallway and the shouting, and the way I turned around instead of walking in. I went back to my hotel and packed. I told myself I was done. But then his team called, thanked me for keeping it clean, and offered to fly me home first class. I accepted. And that's what broke me. Not the offer, my acceptance. Why did you accept? Because I didn't want to make a scene. Because I thought if I left loud, I'd lose everything. I thought I could at least leave quiet. Did you? No. I went back the next year. A collective breath was held across the courtroom. What made you stop finally? Jake looked toward the ceiling, then back down. In 2022, I saw one of the young women again. Not at a party, not at a gala, in a hospital chapel. She was sitting in the back. She didn't recognize me, but I recognized her. And she looked empty, like everything had been drained from her. I didn't approach her. I couldn't. I felt too ashamed. But that was the moment. I walked out of that chapel and I said to myself, if you don't speak now, you're never allowed to preach again. Did you? No. I waited another year, and that's what hurts most. Even after that moment, I still hesitated, still calculated, still feared. The prosecutor was silent. The jury was still. Even the guards looked like they were holding something inside. Do you believe there are more stories like hers? Yes, dozens, maybe more. Why haven't we heard them? Because silence is easier than truth, and because people like me made it seem holy. And now? Jake's voice didn't rise, but it deepened. Now I know that nothing holy ever grows in a lie. The prosecutor stepped back slowly. Bishop Jake, if you could speak to that young woman in the chapel now, what would you say? Jake didn't hesitate. I'd say I saw you. I knew, and I'm sorry I didn't act. I'd say I was supposed to be a shepherd, but that night I was just a man too afraid to follow the sound of your pain. I'd say I failed you, and I'd mean it. The silence that followed was sacred, not the kind that demanded reverence, the kind that begged for healing. And as Jake sat there, eyes low, hands folded again, not in performance, not in prayer, but in reckoning, everyone in that room understood that Chapter 3 wasn't about judgment. It was about truth. And truth, at last, had been allowed to speak. The air inside the courtroom had changed. It wasn't just thick with tension anymore, it was haunted. People sat differently. Jurors shifted in their seats like the weight of someone else's past had somehow landed in their own laps. Bishop Jake returned for the fourth round of testimony, not with more strength, but with something else entirely resolved. There was no doubt in his steps now, no hesitation in the way he took the stand. The prosecutor stood with a silence of her own, one earned through listening not for gaps, but for grief. Bishop Jake, she said, not gently this time, but directly. You've told us what you saw, what you heard, what you failed to do. But now I need you to tell us what you've been carrying. Not what Diddy did, but what you didn't stop. Jake blinked once, slowly. There was a night, he began. A night that rewrote everything I thought I understood about silence. The jury leaned in unconsciously. It was billed as a men's reset weekend, a retreat, a time of prayer and renewal. That's what I was told, what I believed. But when I arrived, it wasn't a retreat. It was a fortress. Phones were taken. NDAs were handed out at the door. The guests weren't churchmen. They were tycoons, producers, influencers, athletes. Every man in that house had something to protect and something to hide. His voice didn't waver. If anything, it sounded colder now. Not bitter, but sharpened. At first, I thought maybe I could still do some good. Maybe I was there to balance the energy, to bring perspective. But that illusion didn't last long. What changed? The prosecutor asked. Jake inhaled. I heard shouting, not from the main area, from a suite down the hall. I walked toward the noise, and as I passed a half-open door, I saw a young man, couldn't have been more than 20, backed into a corner. Diddy stood in front of him, flanked by two other men. The boy's face was pale, eyes wide. Diddy said, "You want access? Then you do what's required." A wave rippled through the gallery. A juror lowered her eyes. Another gripped the arms of his chair. I froze. I wanted to go in, to say something. But before I could move, a man stepped into the hallway and blocked me. Said, "This isn't your kind of ministry tonight, Pastor." I should have pushed past him. I should have shouted. I should have done anything but what I did. I turned around. I walked away. Why? The prosecutor asked, her voice low now. Because I told myself it wasn't my war, that I didn't have proof, that I couldn't afford the fallout, that I was a pastor, not a whistleblower. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid not of what they'd do to me, but of what they'd take from me. And what was that? Jake's voice cracked now. My platform, my people, my comfort, my illusion that I could be close to evil and still stay clean. Did you speak to Diddy about that night? No, I avoided him. And when he messaged me days later, all he said was, "Thanks for staying solid." That message destroyed me. Why? Because I understood exactly what it meant. He wasn't thanking me for friendship. He was thanking me for silence. The gallery stirred, but not loudly. This was no longer shock. This was grief. Did you know what would happen to that young man? No, Jake said, but I knew enough to know that whatever happened after I left, I didn't stop it, and that made me part of it. Have you ever seen him again? No, Jake said, but I think about him every day, and when I close my eyes at night, it's not the sermons that echo, it's his face. The way he looked at Diddy, the way he looked at me just for a second like maybe I could save him, and then I walked away. The prosecutor let it hang, let everyone feel it. Do you believe justice can come from this? Not the kind with jail bars, Jake said, but the kind that stops the pattern, that calls it what it is, that makes others think twice before they hand their conscience over to charisma. What do you want the jury to understand from this? That silence is not passive, that it doesn't just observe evil, it enables it, it cloaks it, it blesses it. Have you ever publicly acknowledged this guilt before? Jake shook his head. No, only to God, and now to you. What do you believe silence cost the people who trusted you? Jake looked toward the gallery now. Everything, their trust, their safety, their chance to be believed. Because if the man they saw as a spiritual anchor stood by and did nothing, why would anyone else listen? And what do you say to them now? That I see you, that I failed you, that I will never again call fear discernment, that I will never again baptize cowardice with Scripture. A tear slipped down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it. Do you believe others in that house that night were also complicit? Jake hesitated, then nodded. Yes, some are pastors, some are entertainers, some are executives. We were all in the room, and none of us spoke. Why not? Because Diddy made silence feel like wisdom, like protection, like strategy. But it was just rot, covered in velvet. Has anyone else come forward? Not publicly, but I've received messages, whispers, hints, and every time I told them I was praying, but I wasn't. I was hiding. Why tell all of this now? Because revival doesn't come with choirs. It comes with truth, and I've withheld mine for far too long. And the prosecutor didn't press further. She didn't need to. The silence afterward didn't feel like a pause. It felt like a burial of years, of complicity, of power that was never supposed to be protected. Jake sat back, exhaled, and looked down at his hands again. For once, they weren't shaking, but something in him had undeniably broken, and in the breaking, he was finally telling the truth. By the time Bishop Jake took the stand for the final time, the courtroom no longer felt like a legal arena. It felt like something else entirely, like a sacred space gutted by truth. There were no more whispers, no more glances exchanged between jurors. Even the press sat still, pens in hand but unmoving, as if afraid that the act of writing would desecrate what they were witnessing. Jake's posture was different now. Not slouched with shame, not rigid with fear, but open, like a man who had carried a weight for far too long and had finally chosen to lay it down, no matter what it crushed on the way down. The prosecutor didn't speak at first. She let the silence breathe. She let it wrap around the room and settle on everyone's shoulders. When she finally approached, her tone had changed. It was no longer investigative. It was conclusive. "Bishop Jake," she began, "in the years you stayed close to Mr. Diddy, did he ever explicitly ask you to lie?" Jake shook his head. "No, he didn't need to. He never asked for lies. He just asked for my presence. And that was enough to make others think he had changed." "Did he ever warn you not to speak?" "Not with threats," Jake said, "but with gratitude, with gifts, with opportunities he could offer or take away. He once said, 'You're too influential to be reckless with loyalty.' I knew exactly what he meant." "Did you ever feel like you had a choice?" "Always, and that's what haunts me, because I chose wrong, over and over." "Have you spoken to him since your decision to testify?" Jake nodded. "He sent me a message. No greetings, no explanation, just 5 words. 'Thanks for staying solid again.'" A juror flinched. Another closed her eyes. "What did you take that to mean?" "That even now, he still believed I would protect him. That even after everything, I was still his cover. That message broke whatever was left in me." "Did you respond?" "No." "Do you believe others in your position still protect him today?" "Yes," Jake said, "because he built a system where silence feels safer than truth, and because people like me reinforce that system by not breaking it sooner." The prosecutor stepped forward. Her voice was quiet now. "What do you want your congregation to know? The people who trusted you, who followed your sermons, who believed you stood on the side of righteousness." Jake looked up for the first time since the session began. His eyes found the back of the room, as if searching for someone who wasn't there. "I want them to know I failed them, that I mistook proximity for purpose, that I believed I could stay close to corruption and not become part of it, that I was wrong." He paused, then continued. "There are young women watching this trial right now who were hurt in rooms I walked into and walked out of. There are young men who were silenced by people who praised me on Sunday. I want them to know their silence wasn't the sin, mine was." A sound from the gallery, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone stifling a sob. "I used to preach that God could use anyone," Jake said, "but I never imagined he'd use my failure, my exposure, my shame, to make a crack in a wall that's stood too long." The prosecutor let the moment stretch. "Do you believe justice can come from this?" "Not just for Diddy, Jake said, "but for the system. For the people who were hurt by silence that looked holy. For the ones who thought no one saw them. Yes, I believe justice can begin here. Do you feel you've said everything that needed to be said?" Jake inhaled deeply. "Almost." He turned slightly in the witness chair, not toward the prosecutor, not toward the defense, but toward the jury. "There's one more truth," he said, voice like gravel but clearer than ever. "There was a moment, early on, when I could have stopped all of this, when I saw the pattern begin, when I heard him say things that weren't jokes but policies, when I watched the mask slip and the monster emerge, and I said nothing. I called it a burden. I called it discernment. But what it was cowardice dressed as loyalty. And I need you to know that I see it now, not just in him, in me." The prosecutor stepped back. She didn't ask another question. She didn't need to. Jake had finished what he came to do, not with vengeance, not with fury, but with something more dangerous: honesty. The judge looked shaken, not surprised, shaken. The jury had stopped taking notes. Their eyes didn't move from Jake's face, as if afraid he'd vanish before he finished the sentence they didn't know they needed to hear. Jake stepped down from the stand. He didn't look back. Didn't glance at the defense table where Diddy sat, face impassive, but still, for once, completely devoid of power. As Jake passed by the gallery, a few people stood not in applause but in acknowledgement. A woman in sunglasses wiped away a tear. A man whispered something inaudible and crossed himself. Jake walked past all of them and stopped at the door. For one final moment, he turned not to speak, but to exhale. A long breath, a releasing, a shedding of everything he'd carried in shadows. Then the door closed behind him. The courtroom didn't move. The judge cleared his throat but didn't speak immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than it had been all day. This court acknowledges the gravity of the testimony given. We will recess briefly before proceeding with final instructions to the jury. But no one moved. Not for minutes, because the trial was no longer about Diddy Combs' empire. It was about what happens when silence wears a collar, when truth is delayed so long it becomes a scream, and when a man decides, finally, to trade his image for integrity. Back in the jury room, no one spoke right away. A few jurors sat with their hands over their faces. Others clutched their notes like relics from a war they never signed up to witness. When they returned hours later, they carried more than a verdict. They carried history. The foreperson stood, lips trembling, paper in hand. But before she could read it, the gallery leaned forward, not for the legal outcome, but for the human one. Because the verdict, in some ways, had already been delivered. Not by the judge, not by the prosecution, but by the man who had once kept secrets in a pulpit and had now shattered them on the floor of a courtroom. The moment the gavel dropped, something ended. Not just a case, not just a myth, but an era. The lights in the courtroom didn't flicker. The microphones didn't crackle. But everyone felt it. The kingdom of silence had cracked, and there would be no rebuilding it.